Hi, welcome back to the second month of my mini bolt challenge, the challenge where you get to pick the bolt of fabric, whether it's a novelty print, a geometric print, or something else, and I used that entire mini bolt all the way down to the last scrap. This month, the super cute Shamrock print won the vote, and I made not one, not two, but 3 projects out of that entire bolt. I'll walk you through how I decided on each project and the steps I went to make each one. I'll also put a link in the description below for templates on how to make this one if you want to make one for yourself. So let's dive right in and see how I turned that mini Shamrock fabric bolt into a full-fledged quilt and 2 mini quilts to go with it. The first thing I needed to do was figure out how much fabric I was working with. I rolled it out and measured it on my cutting mat, and it was right at 2 yards. I pulled out some other greens from my mini bolt stash to get the creative juices flowing, and I picked a few that I thought would play well with the print. I even pulled out my green scrap basket looking for more color inspiration. I pulled a lot of different green shades, and if you look closely, you can see some yellow dots in one of the shamrocks on my main print. So I pulled some yellowish green prints just to get a look. Some were too yellow, and others were too busy, but I did find a few that might make the final cut. I was on the fence with a few of them, like this dot print, but I kept them around for a bit. Some of the others, though, were a definite no. My first thought was to make an Irish chain quilt, but I already made a green one in 2023, and I'll be making another one in May for my Island Batik Ambassador project, so I decided I would focus on something new. After getting an idea of all the green prints I had, I fiddled around an electric quilt. I like playing around with blocks that give the illusion of circles. I think that's why so many of my quilts have that V block or the triangle and the square block in them. So I started with triangles and I tweaked a few different layouts, and I finally came up with this version that you see here. I thought about making the pinwheels scrappy, different shades of green, but then I finally just decided to stick with 2 colors. So I went back to my fabrics and I narrowed it down to 5 prints. The main shamrocks, 2 medium greens, 1 light green, and then the background fabric. I normally paper piece these type of blocks, but this time I wanted to try templates. Again, I'll have the link in the description below for templates for this one if you want to make them, and I'll do the traditional templates and paper piecing, depending on which one you like to work with. This quilt is made up of 2 different blocks, a kaleidoscope block with 2 color variations and a pinwheel block. Each block measures at 6.5 inches, so when you sew it into the quilt, it'll be 6 inches finished. To get the green points surrounding the pinwheel block in the overall design, one set of kaleidoscope blocks needs to have 2 different prints, the Shamrock print and a medium green print. The other set of kaleidoscope blocks had all Shamrock prints. I chain pieced my units so things went together pretty quick, but my cutting with the templates must have had some minuscule miscuts, because this is where the challenge came in. Not all my pieces wanted to line up perfectly. I had to do some fudging to get some of my shapes to fit, but in the end, everything turned out pretty good. Again, that's why I usually paper piece some of these blocks that have lots of odd angles, because for some reason, no matter how close I'm cutting or how good I'm sewing, my odd angles always end up a little short or a little big, or they're just wonky. So that's why I like to paper piece a lot. When I paper piece, I don't have to worry about my ruler moving a hair's width away when I'm cutting from my template. And even that can mess up the alignment when you start putting things together, especially when you have a lot of pieces, because a lot of pieces will just expound and expound upon each other and then they get off. But this time I really wanted to try using templates, and it taught me that I still have room to grow. Once all the blocks were made, it was time to lay out my rows. The quilt is made up of 2 alternating rows. The first row is made all of kaleidoscope blocks. I started with a mixed kaleidoscope block and then alternated that with the full Shamrock version till I had 7 blocks across, and I made 5 of these rows. The second row is made up of alternating pinwheel blocks and mixed kaleidoscope blocks, and I made 4 of these rows. The key here is to turn the mixed kaleidoscope block 90 degrees from the way it was lined up in the first row. This will line up the medium green fabric all the way around the pinwheel block when all the rows are sewn together. So the quilt is made up of 9 rows, and I alternated these rows until I had my top. I did do a lot of pinning for these rows because there are a lot of points that need to match up. And some of them are odd angles, they don't quite butt up against each other, like right here, where these 2 joints come together. The pins helped keep everything together and kept my points lined up. There are a few points that don't quite line up like I wanted. The pin may have slipped, or I may have slid the fabric just over a little bit too much before I pinned it. But I'm not going to worry about those. I'm not putting this into a show. This is just going to be for me. It's going to keep my legs warm while I watch TV in March. So I just left them. After all the rows were together, it was time to add the borders. Even with fudging some of my pieces and my blocks, the quilt still came out pretty accurate to the size of the 6-inch blocks. So I cut my borders to match that and sewed them on. Even though my borders were cut to the perfect size, I still like to pin them. I use about 5 or 6 pins, not a whole bunch, just enough to keep it from sliding so I don't get that little smidge at the bottom hanging over when I'm done. I pieced my backing again using some older green prints I had in my stash. I quilted it with an all-over meander. I was just doing swirls and whirls wherever I felt like it. There was no real pattern, just some curvy doodling all over the quilt. After I was done quilting, I had about 12 inches of my Shamrock fabric left, so I decided to squeeze some binding out of that. I cut out 6 strips at 2 1/4 inches and had the perfect amount. Literally. Check out how this edge lined up when I was matching the binding. I didn't have to trim anything off. It was a perfect fit. That doesn't happen very often. Very rare, matter of fact. And that's my first project. I'm super happy about it. It turned out great. I love all the different shades of greens and how the different fabrics I chose kind of pulled out some of the other fabrics that were in those Shamrocks. I'm excited to use it in March, and it's going to look great draped over the couch. Once I had my main quilt done, I still had some fabric left over. And as part of this challenge, I had used every single scrap. My personal rule is to save anything 1 inch or bigger. After cutting everything for the main quilt, this is what I had left over. I had 2 long 1-inch strips and some odd angled scraps. I thought about making Ohio star blocks, but the angled pieces were not big enough to make full quarter square triangles. I thought about making some 54/40 or fight blocks, but again I didn't have enough big pieces to make the triangles that I needed for those blocks. Then my mind drifted back to a mini double Irish chain I had made many years ago. It was just a top that I had made from leftover green scraps, and I'd sold it on eBay. That was back in the day when eBay was all about auctions. It's a little bit different nowadays, but back then I was able to sell a couple quilt tops every now and then to help pay for my fabric addiction. Once in a while I think back to that little quilt and I think how cute it would have looked on one of my tables. That memory cinched the deal on what I was going to do with these leftover scraps. Make another mini Irish double chain, and this one keep it for my table. I knew for sure that I could get enough 1-inch squares to make this mini quilt, but I knew I would have a little bit left over, and they were kind of an odd number and I wasn't sure what to do with it. So I added in another print. That gave me enough to make a regular mini quilt, along with another even smaller one for a little hot pad for the table. To make these, I cut some 1-inch squares and some 1-inch strips, and I sold my main fabric with some light fabric and then a medium green fabric. When I had the strips, it's easier to sew strips and then cut those into the size I needed. So I sewed these together with mini strip sets. When I make regular Irish chains, I make big strip sets going all the way across, 5 blocks across. But I didn't have long enough strips for my main fabric, so I decided to sew these together with little 4 patches, and then a middle piece, and then one long center. It was fun to make these cute little tiny blocks. Even with these little blocks, I did lots of pinning, because when the quilts get smaller and the points are off, you can definitely see it. Way more than you can see it in a big quilt. So I spent a lot of time to make sure that these were pinned and lined up right. And it turned out super cute. The texture feels really cool when you rub your hands over all those little tiny 1/2-inch squares. It was fun to put together. I really like playing with really tiny pieces. It's fun to see a big quilt shrunk down into a little tiny small quilt. Like I said, I added that extra fabric so I would have enough blocks to play with for another small project. So I made a very small mini Irish chain. I sewed together pieces left over from the backing of the main quilt. It was a good way to use up some of those leftover pieces as well. This one's small enough it can go on the table, it can be used as a little hot pad, it can be put in the corner with some little trinkets around it for the holidays. It's super cute, and I had really fun with it. Since these were both small projects, I quilted them on my regular machine, and I did some straight stitching down the chains, and in the white spaces I did like a little daisy swirly thing. I didn't mark it, I used the points where the white blocks ended to figure out where I wanted to put my petals, and I ended up with a swirl in the end. I love the texture on the back. As you can see, I finally figured out where to put the dot print. I used it on the back of this mini, and it was perfect. And these little minis are the perfect size to practice your free motion quilting on. That's how I learned. I learned on little mini quilts, on little postcard quilts, and when I did it small on these little quilts, I was able to go to the bigger quilts with a little bit more confidence. So there you have it, 3 fun projects from 2 yards of Shamrock fabric. And this is a part where I need your help. I have 3 new bolts for you guys to help me choose from for next month. Option 1 is a fun blue and green paisley print. Option 2 is this nice, bright, funky flowers with a little bit of gray background. And option number 3 are some butterflies. When I pulled these bolts off the shelf, I decided to stick with some nice spring colors. I'll be working on this in March, and it should be done right at the beginning of April, and that'll give me a nice, beautiful quilt to have just in time for spring. To vote, just leave a comment below about which bolt number you want me to use. I'll post another picture real quick so you can see which bolt corresponds with each number. I'll leave the voting open for a few days, and on Wednesday, March 5th, I'll tally all the votes, and the mini bolt that gets the most votes is the bolt that I'll use all the fabric of, all the way down to the last scrap. I'll show what I made with the winning fabric near the end of the month. So be sure that you're subscribed and you have the notification bell clicked so you never miss an episode. Well, that's it for today's episode. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm really enjoying this challenge. It's fun to have you guys pick which fabric you want me to work with, and it's fun to have that challenge to use it all up. I'm so glad that I could share my process with you on how I pick out my patterns and how I design and figure out how things are going to go and get put together. I love to talk about quilting. If you've made a Shamrock quilt or any quilt for March, let me know. Let's talk about it. I'd love to hear your ideas and get some inspiration from you as well. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, happy sewing.